The Grand Council chamber of the Velthran Empire fell silent as the holographic display showed the impossible. Ambassador Thrix, a tall being with deep blue skin and 4 arms, stood frozen as he watched the human diplomat shake hands with the Korthan warlord. The Korthans had never agreed to peace in their 10,000-year history. They had burned worlds, destroyed entire civilizations, and laughed at every attempt at negotiation. Yet here was this small, soft human with her warm smile, signing a peace treaty with the most feared warrior species in the galaxy. "Impossible," whispered High Minister Galvorn, his silver robes rustling as he leaned forward. "The Korthans have rejected every diplomatic mission we have ever sent. We lost 12 ambassadors trying to negotiate with them." "The humans did it in 3 weeks," said Thrix, his voice hollow with disbelief. 3 weeks and a lot of something they call coffee." The Velthran Empire was ancient. They had built their civilization over 50,000 years, spreading across hundreds of star systems. They were known for their advanced technology, their strict protocols, and their logical approach to all things. They had a department for everything, rules for every situation, and forms that needed to be filled in triplicate for the smallest decisions. Their diplomacy followed the Grand Protocol, a document so large it took up an entire library. And yet in the last century, they had failed at almost every major negotiation. The frontier wars dragged on with no end in sight. The trade disputes with the merchant collective had cost them billions. And now, watching the humans succeed where they had failed so completely, the High Council of Velthran was forced to face an uncomfortable truth. "We need their help," said Counselor Marin, the youngest member of the High Council at only 400 years old. She had always been the one to speak the difficult truths. "Our diplomatic corps has failed. Our methods are not working. The humans have achieved in 50 years what we could not achieve in 50,000. "You suggest we ask the humans to teach us?" Galvorn's voice carried a hint of offense. "We are the oldest civilization in this sector. We have protocols that predate their entire species." "And those protocols are failing us," Marin replied calmly. "The humans are new to the galactic stage. They have no great fleets, no ancient technologies, no vast wealth. Yet species that refuse to speak with us invite them to dinner parties. Enemies who have sworn blood oaths against each other sit down and compromise when humans are in the room. We cannot ignore this any longer." Thrix nodded slowly. He had spent the last decade studying human diplomatic methods, watching their embassy staff work their strange magic. He had seen them turn hostile negotiations into friendly discussions with nothing more than patience and what they called empathy. He had watched them diffuse crises with humor and build alliances with shared meals. "The humans have something we do not," Thrix said. "I have studied them extensively. They call it emotional intelligence. They read feelings the way we read data. They understand what people need even when those people cannot express it themselves." "Feelings," Galvorn said the word like it tasted bad. "You want us to base our diplomacy on feelings?" "I want us to win our diplomacy," Thrix replied. "The method matters less than the result, and the results speak for themselves." The debate continued for 3 more days, as was traditional for any major decision in Velthran society. Arguments were made, data was analyzed, and ancient precedents were reviewed. In the end, the vote was close, but the decision was made. The Velthran Empire would formally request human diplomatic advisors. The news spread quickly across the galaxy. The ancient Velthrans, proud and protocol-bound, were asking the young humans for help. Some species laughed, others were confused. The humans themselves seemed both honored and slightly amused by the request. Ambassador Sarah Chen received the assignment with her typical grace. At 45, she was considered young for such an important post, but her record spoke for itself. She had negotiated the end of 3 civil wars, prevented 2 genocides, and once talked a suicide bomber into becoming a peace activist over a cup of tea. When the Velthran request came through, she smiled and started packing her bags. "The Velthrons," said her assistant Marcus, a young man with curly hair and endless optimism. "They're the ones with all the rules, right? 700,000 pages of diplomatic protocol," Sarah confirmed. "Their negotiators spend the first decade of their career just memorizing the proper way to address different species. And they want us to help them. They want us to help them connect," Sarah said. "There's a difference between knowing the rules and understanding people. They've mastered the first. We need to help them with the second." Their ship arrived at Velthron Prime 3 weeks later. The capital world was beautiful in a severe way, all sharp angles and perfect symmetry. The buildings rose in precise mathematical patterns, each one exactly the right height and width according to some ancient regulation. The streets were clean and empty, transportation handled by underground systems that moved with perfect efficiency. "It's very organized," Marcus said, looking out the window of their transport. "It's very lonely," Sarah replied quietly. They were met at the landing platform by Ambassador Thrix himself, along with a delegation of 15 officials, each one introduced with their full title and position. The welcoming ceremony took 2 hours and involved 3 different traditional rituals, 2 formal gift exchanges, and a recitation of the historical relationship between their species that went back to humanity's first contact with the Velthron Empire. Sarah participated in each ritual with genuine interest, asking questions about the meaning behind each gesture. Thrix found himself explaining traditions he had performed 1,000 times without thinking about why. By the end of the ceremony, he realized he was smiling, something he could not remember doing in years. "You are different from the diplomats we have hosted before," he said as they walked toward the embassy quarters. "How so?" Sarah asked. "You seem actually curious about us. Most visitors simply endure our ceremonies and wait for the business discussions to begin." "Your ceremonies are fascinating," Sarah said. "That third ritual, the sharing of the memory stone, that's about acknowledging shared history, isn't it? Making sure both sides remember where they came from before discussing where they're going." Thrix stopped walking. In 400 years of diplomatic service, no one had ever actually understood the meaning of that ritual on their first encounter. "Yes," he said slowly, "that is exactly what it means. Most species think it is simply a formality." "Nothing is simply a formality," Sarah said. "Every tradition exists because someone somewhere thought it was important. Understanding why things matter to people is how you understand the people themselves." At that moment, Thrix understood why the council had made their decision, and he began to hope that perhaps the humans could indeed teach them something new. The first formal meeting between the human advisors and the Velthron diplomatic corps took place in the Grand Protocol Chamber, a massive hall filled with ancient texts and ceremonial objects. 100 Velthron diplomats sat in perfect rows, their posture rigid, their expressions carefully neutral. They had been trained from youth to show no emotion, to rely only on logic and procedure. Sarah stood at the front of the room with Marcus by her side. She looked at the sea of blue faces and saw not intimidating officials, but people who had spent their lives following rules that no longer worked. She saw frustration hidden behind masks of calm. She saw pride wounded by repeated failures. She saw, beneath all the training and protocol, beings who genuinely wanted to serve their people but did not know how. "Thank you for welcoming us," she began, speaking without notes, a practice that immediately drew suspicious looks. "I know that asking for help is not easy, especially for a civilization as accomplished as yours. So let me start by saying something that might surprise you. We don't have all the answers. Humans make mistakes in diplomacy all the time. We've started wars over misunderstandings. We've lost peace because of pride. We're not here because we're perfect." The Velthrons exchanged glances. This was not how speeches were supposed to begin. "We're here because we believe that diplomacy is not about perfect protocols," Sarah continued. "It's about connection. It's about understanding that the person across the table from you has fears and hopes and dreams just like you do. And when you understand that, really understand it, protocols become tools instead of chains. A young diplomat in the third row raised her hand. This was unusual, as questions were traditionally saved for the formal query period at the end of presentations. "Yes," Sarah said, pointing to her. "How do you understand what someone is feeling when they are trained to hide their feelings, as we are?" Sarah smiled. "That's exactly the right question, and honestly, you start by admitting that you have feelings too." The room went very quiet. Among the Velthrons, admitting to emotional responses was considered a weakness, a failure of proper training. "I know that seems strange to you," Sarah said. "Your training teaches you to suppress emotions, to focus only on logic. But here's what I've learned in 20 years of diplomacy. Every species, everywhere in the galaxy, has emotions. Some show them openly, some hide them carefully, but they're always there. And when you pretend emotions don't exist, you can't account for them in your negotiations. You end up confused when logical arguments don't work, when perfect solutions are rejected, when wars continue despite everyone knowing they should end." Thrix watched from the back of the room. He had invited Sarah to give this presentation despite objections from more traditional council members. Now, watching his colleagues lean forward with interest despite their training, he knew he had made the right choice. "Let me give you an example," Sarah said. "The Korthan peace treaty that everyone has been discussing. Do you know why the Korthans finally agreed to peace?" Silence. No one knew. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy had been trying to figure it out for months. "They agreed because I asked the warlord about his children." The room erupted in confused murmuring. Sarah waited until it settled. "The Korthans are warriors. They value strength and victory above all else. That's what everyone knows about them. But what most people don't know is that Korthan parents are incredibly devoted to their children. They fight so that their children will have a stronger future. When I asked Warlord Threk about his offspring, he talked for 3 hours about their accomplishments, their personalities, their dreams. And when I pointed out that continued war meant his grandchildren would grow up in the same cycle of violence, he listened. Not because my argument was logically superior, but because I had connected with what actually mattered to him." A senior diplomat stood up, breaking protocol entirely. "You are suggesting we should discuss personal matters in formal negotiations." "I'm suggesting you should see the people you're negotiating with as people," Sarah replied. "Not as representatives of positions, not as obstacles to overcome, but as individuals with their own stories and their own reasons. When you understand someone's story, you can help them write a better ending." The meeting continued for several more hours, filled with questions that broke every rule about formal query periods. Sarah answered each one honestly, sometimes admitting she didn't know the answer, sometimes sharing stories of her own failures. By the end, something had shifted in the room. The rigid posture had relaxed slightly. The neutral expressions had softened. And Thrix noticed something remarkable. Several of his colleagues were smiling. The real training began the next day. Sarah and Marcus split up, each working with different groups of Velthran diplomats. The curriculum they had developed was simple in theory but challenging in practice. It focused on 3 core skills that humans considered basic but that the Velthrans had never been taught. The first skill was listening. Not the formal listening that involved waiting for someone to finish speaking so you could respond with the appropriate protocol. Real listening, the kind that paid attention to tone and body language and the words people chose and the words they avoided. "When someone speaks," Sarah explained to her group, "they're telling you much more than just the content of their words. They're telling you what matters to them, what worries them, what they need. Your job is to hear all of it." She had them practice with recordings of past negotiations, pointing out all the signals that had been missed. Here, a trade representative's voice had cracked slightly when discussing certain goods, revealing which items were truly essential to their economy. There, a military commander had paused too long before answering a question about fleet positions, suggesting uncertainty about their strategy. "We heard these words," a Velthran diplomat said, reviewing one recording, "but we did not hear the meaning behind them." "That's exactly it," Sarah said. "Now let's practice hearing the meaning." The second skill was empathy, which proved to be the most difficult for the Velthrans. Their training had taught them to analyze situations objectively, to remove personal feelings from the equation. The idea of deliberately trying to feel what someone else was feeling seemed almost dangerous to them. Marcus worked with a group of younger diplomats on this skill, using a technique he had developed. He would describe a situation and ask them to imagine they were the other party in a negotiation. "The merchant collective has refused your trade offer," he said. "They say your terms are unfair, but here's some background. Their homeworld recently suffered a famine. Their people are hungry and afraid. Their government is under pressure to show strength. Now, how do you think they feel when a wealthy empire like Velthran offers them what you consider a fair deal?" A young diplomat named Keth struggled with the exercise. "I know logically that they would feel threatened and defensive, but knowing this does not help me feel it." "Close your eyes," Marcus said. "Imagine you're a merchant collective representative. Your family has been eating reduced rations for months. Your children ask you every night when there will be more food. You go to work knowing that if you don't make good deals, your people will suffer. Then a Velthran diplomat arrives, well-fed and calm, and offers you terms that seem fair on paper but that you know will keep your people dependent on imports for generations. How does that feel?" Keth was quiet for a long moment. When he opened his eyes, they were wet with something that might have been tears, an expression of emotion that he had been trained since childhood to suppress. "It feels desperate," he said, "and it feels angry, and it makes me want to reject the offer even if it hurts my people, because accepting it feels like surrender." "Now you understand why logical arguments alone don't work," Marcus said gently. "Now you can start to think about what would actually help." The third skill was flexibility, the ability to abandon plans and protocols when the situation required it. This was perhaps the hardest concept for the Velthrans, who had built their entire civilization on the foundation of proper procedures. Sarah addressed this directly in a joint session with both groups. "Protocols are useful," she said. "They provide structure and predictability, but they can also become traps. When you follow protocol instead of responding to what's actually happening, you lose the ability to adapt. And in diplomacy, adaptation is everything." She showed them recordings of human negotiations, where diplomats had thrown out their entire strategy in response to new information. One involved a trade negotiation, where the human representative had suddenly changed the subject to discuss art after noticing a painting in the room, discovering that the opposing negotiator was a collector who had never met anyone else who appreciated his hobby. The negotiation had succeeded because both parties had connected over something unexpected. "How can we function without protocols?" asked a senior diplomat. "How do we know what to do if we have no rules to follow?" "You know what to do because you understand what you're trying to achieve," Sarah replied. "The goal of diplomacy is not to follow rules correctly. The goal is to find solutions that work for everyone. When you keep that goal in mind, you can find many paths to reach it." The training continued for weeks, and slowly the Velthran diplomats began to change. It was not easy. Centuries of conditioning could not be undone overnight, but something new was growing in the diplomatic corps, a sense that perhaps there was another way to serve their empire. And soon they would have a chance to put their new skills to the test. The crisis began with a single shot. A Velthran patrol vessel, operating near the border of the Sarath Confederation, had fired on a Sarath civilian ship. The details were unclear, the reasons disputed, but the result was undeniable. 17 Sarath citizens were dead, including a member of a prominent family with connections to the Sarath ruling council. The Sarath Confederation was already hostile toward the Velthran Empire. Centuries of border disputes and economic competition had created deep distrust between the two powers. This incident threatened to ignite a war that could consume both civilizations. High Minister Galvorn convened an emergency session of the council. The traditional response was clear: deny responsibility, demand a formal investigation through proper channels, and prepare the fleet for possible conflict. It was what the protocols dictated. But Ambassador Thrix had another idea. "Let me take the human advisors to the Sarath capital," he requested. "Let us try their methods before we resort to the old ways." The council was divided. Many argued that this was no time for experiments, that the situation was too dangerous for untested approaches. But Councillor Marin spoke in favor of the mission, pointing out that the traditional approach had failed to prevent tensions from reaching this point in the first place. In the end, Galvorn made the decision personally. "Go," he told Thrix, "but understand that if you fail, we may lose our chance for a peaceful resolution." Thrix brought Sarah, Marcus, and 3 Velthran diplomats who had shown the most progress in their training. The journey to Sarath took 2 days, during which they prepared for what would be the most challenging negotiation of their lives. "The Sarath are proud and emotional," Thrix explained, sharing what intelligence he had. "They value honor above all else. The death of these citizens is not just a political crisis for them, it is a personal wound to every Sarath." "Then we need to address the wound, not just the politics," Sarah said. "We need to acknowledge their pain before we can discuss solutions." "That is not our way," said one of the Velthran diplomats, a woman named Veth who had struggled with the training but had refused to give up. "We express condolences formally, as protocol dictates." "Formal condolences won't be enough," Sarah replied. "Not for something like this. They need to know that we actually care about their loss, not just that we're following proper procedures." The Sarath capital was everything the Velthran capital was not. Where Velthran Prime was orderly and precise, Sarath Prime was chaotic and colorful. Buildings rose at odd angles, covered in murals and banners. The streets were filled with citizens expressing their grief and anger openly, some weeping, some shouting, all of them united in their pain. The delegation was met at the landing platform by a group of Sarath officials whose faces showed barely contained fury. The traditional greeting ritual was performed, but the words were spoken with cold precision, each syllable carrying an unspoken accusation. Sarah watched carefully, noting how the Sarath officials kept glancing at the Velthran diplomats with suspicion and hostility. She saw grief beneath the anger, fear beneath the pride. These were people who had lost friends and family, who were afraid of losing more. The first negotiation session took place in a grand hall decorated with images of the 17 victims. It was a deliberate choice, a reminder that real people had died. The Sarath negotiator, a tall woman named Kira, began with a formal denunciation of Velthran aggression that lasted for nearly an hour. According to traditional Velthran protocol, Thrix should have responded with a formal defense and a demand for evidence. Instead, following what he had learned, he did something different. He apologized. "The Velthran Empire grieves with you," he said, his voice carrying an emotion that surprised even himself. 17 lives were lost. 17 families were destroyed. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the investigation reveals, that loss is real and it is tragic. I cannot undo what was done, but I can tell you, speaking not as a representative of my government but as one being to another, that I am truly sorry for your pain. The hall went silent. Kira stared at Thrix as if he had grown a second head. Velthran diplomats did not apologize. They did not express emotion. They certainly did not speak as individuals rather than representatives. "You speak pretty words," Kira said finally, "but words do not bring back the dead." No, Thrix agreed. They do not. Nothing can bring back the dead, but perhaps we can honor them by ensuring that no more lives are lost to this conflict. Perhaps their deaths can be the last, rather than the first of many. Sarah leaned forward slightly, catching Kira's eye. Minister Kira, I understand that you lost someone personally in this incident. A cousin, I believe. Kira's expression flickered. How do you know that? Because grief that deep cannot be hidden. I see it in your eyes, in the way you hold yourself. I'm sorry for your loss, truly sorry. Not because my government told me to say so, but because losing someone you love is the hardest thing anyone can experience. For a moment, Kira's mask of anger slipped, revealing the raw pain beneath. Then she composed herself and looked away. This is a negotiation, not a therapy session, she said. We are here to discuss reparations and accountability. Of course, Sarah said. But before we discuss terms, may I ask you something? What would justice look like to you? Not to your government, not to your protocols, but to you personally. If you could have anything that would help heal this wound, what would it be? It was an unusual question, one that had no place in traditional diplomatic exchanges. But Kira found herself considering it seriously. I want to know why, she said finally. I want to understand how this happened, and I want to know that it will never happen again. Then perhaps that's where we should start, Sarah said. Not with accusations and defenses, but with understanding. Let's find out together what happened and why. Let's make sure it never happens again. And let's do it as partners, not as enemies. The negotiation continued for 3 days. There were moments of tension, moments when old habits nearly derailed the process. But slowly, something changed. The Sarath negotiators began to see the Velthrans not as faceless representatives of an enemy power, but as individuals struggling to do the right thing. The Velthran diplomats began to understand the depth of Sarath grief and the cultural importance of honor in their society. On the 4th day, Kira asked to speak with Sarah privately. I do not understand you humans, she said. Your ambassador Thrix apologized. He showed emotion. Among my people that would be a sign of weakness, but somehow it did not feel weak. It felt real. Showing emotion is not weakness, Sarah replied. Showing emotion is honesty, and honesty is the foundation of trust. How can you trust someone who hides everything they feel? How can you negotiate with someone who won't be real with you? Kira was quiet for a long moment. Our conflict with the Velthrans goes back centuries. We have fought, we have argued, we have signed treaties that fell apart within years, but we have never actually talked to each other. Not like this. Would you like to? And so, 2 leaders who had expected to be enemies sat down and simply talked. They talked about their families, their fears, their hopes for their people. They discovered that they had more in common than they had ever imagined. Both were parents. Both had lost loved ones. Both wanted a future where their children would not have to continue the same old conflicts. The final agreement was unlike any treaty the Velthran Empire had ever signed. It included formal reparations and accountability measures, as tradition required. But it also included something new, a joint memorial for the victims, a cultural exchange program for young people from both civilizations, a direct communication channel between leaders, bypassing the slow, formal protocols that had allowed misunderstandings to fester. And most importantly, it included a simple statement that both sides had agreed to together. We are not enemies. We are neighbors who have forgotten how to be neighbors. Today, we begin to remember. When the delegation returned to Velthran Prime, they were met with celebration. The crisis had been averted. War had been prevented. But High Minister Galvorn was more interested in something else. How, he asked Thrix, how did you accomplish what centuries of traditional diplomacy could not? Thrix thought carefully before answering. I stopped trying to win, he said. Instead, I tried to understand. And when I understood what they truly needed, finding a solution became simple. Galvorn considered this for a long moment. Then, For the first time in his 300 years of service, he smiled. "Perhaps," he said, "it is time we rewrote our protocols." The transformation of Velthran diplomacy did not happen overnight. Centuries of tradition could not be abandoned in a single moment. But something fundamental had shifted. The success of the Sarath negotiations proved that there was another way, a way that focused on connection rather than procedure, on understanding rather than advantage. Sarah and Marcus stayed on Velthran Prime for another year, working with the diplomatic corps to institutionalize the new approaches. They trained hundreds of diplomats, developed new curriculum for the diplomatic academies, and helped rewrite portions of the Grand Protocol itself. But perhaps their greatest achievement was not any specific change they made. It was the simple fact that they had shown the Velthrans that change was possible. Ambassador Thrix became the first official liaison for humanistic diplomacy, a new position created specifically to continue the work Sarah had started. He traveled across Velthran space, sharing what he had learned, challenging old assumptions, and encouraging his colleagues to see diplomacy as more than just the execution of protocols. "Diplomacy is not about rules," he would say, echoing Sarah's words. "It is about people, and when you understand people, you can help them find peace." The ripple effects spread beyond the Velthran Empire. Other species had watched the Sarath crisis with great interest. When a civilization as ancient and proud as the Velthrans was willing to change, willing to learn from the young humans, it sent a powerful message across the galaxy. Within 5 years, human diplomatic advisors were serving in over 40 different governments. They helped negotiate an end to the frontier wars that had plagued the region for a century. They facilitated trade agreements that brought prosperity to hundreds of worlds. They mediated conflicts that had seemed impossible to resolve. And everywhere they went, they taught the same simple lesson that Sarah had taught on Velthran Prime. Diplomacy is about connection. Understanding is the foundation of peace. And when you see your opponents as people rather than obstacles, everything becomes possible. The final test came 10 years after Sarah's first arrival on Velthran Prime. A crisis erupted that made the Sarath incident look minor by comparison. 3 civilizations stood on the brink of a war that could devastate an entire sector of the galaxy. Ancient hatreds, territorial disputes, and economic pressures had all combined to create a situation that seemed impossible to resolve. The galactic community called for Velthran intervention. The Velthran Empire was now known not just for its ancient protocols, but for its new approach to diplomacy. They were the ones who could find peace where others saw only war. Ambassador Thrix led the delegation, now assisted by a new generation of Velthran diplomats who had been trained from the beginning in the humanistic methods. They arrived at the neutral station where the negotiations would take place, facing representatives from all 3 hostile powers, each one convinced that their cause was just and their enemies were evil. Thrix looked at the assembled faces, seeing the fear and anger and pride that he had once been trained to ignore. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to share a story. 10 years ago, a human diplomat taught me something that changed everything I believed about diplomacy. She taught me that protocols are tools, not chains. She taught me that understanding is more powerful than strategy. And she taught me that even the oldest, most proud civilizations can learn and grow." He paused, looking at each representative in turn. "I know that you have all come here expecting a formal negotiation. You have prepared your positions and your arguments and your demands. You have strategies for victory and plans for acceptable compromise. But I want to ask you something before we begin any of that." The representatives leaned forward, uncertain what was coming. "I want to ask you about your children. I want to ask you what kind of future you hope they will have. And I want us all to remember that every decision we make in this room will shape that future, for better or for worse." Slowly, hesitantly, the representatives began to speak. They talked about their families, their hopes, their fears. They discovered that despite their differences, they all wanted the same thing: peace, prosperity, a future where their children would not have to fight the same old wars. The negotiations lasted for weeks. There were moments of tension, moments when old hatreds threatened to destroy everything. But always, the Velthran diplomats brought the discussion back to what truly mattered. Not territory or resources or pride, but people, families, futures. In the end, they found a solution that none of them had imagined possible at the start. Not a compromise that left everyone equally unhappy, but a genuine resolution that addressed the underlying needs of all parties. The agreement created new institutions for cooperation, new channels for communication, and new opportunities for the next generation to build something better together. When the treaty was signed, one of the representatives turned to Thrix with tears in his eyes. "How did you do this?" he asked. "We have been fighting for so long, we had forgotten that peace was even possible." Thrix smiled, thinking of Sarah, thinking of everything he had learned in the past 10 years. "We remembered that you are people," he said, "and we helped you remember the same about each other." The news of the treaty spread across the galaxy. It was called the greatest diplomatic achievement in 1,000 years, and everyone agreed that it never would have happened without the strange, wonderful humans who had taught the ancient Velthrans how to truly connect. Sarah Chen had returned to Earth years before, but she watched the news with pride. She had always known that the Velthrans were capable of greatness. They had just needed someone to show them that strength and vulnerability were not opposites, that logic and emotion could work together, that the oldest civilizations could learn new ways. She received a message from Thrix after the treaty was signed. "Thank you," it said, "for everything you taught us, for everything you helped us become. The galaxy is a little more peaceful today because of what you showed us 10 years ago, and we are better people because we finally learned how to be people." Sarah smiled and sent a simple reply. "You were always capable of this. You just needed to believe it. Now teach others what you have learned. That's how we change the galaxy, one connection at a time." And in the years that followed, that is exactly what happened. The Velthrans became teachers in turn, spreading the humanistic approach to diplomacy across the galaxy. Species that had never communicated learned to understand each other. Conflicts that had lasted millennia finally found resolution. Peace spread, slowly but surely, from world to world. It had all started with a simple request, with an ancient empire admitting that they needed help. It had started with humans showing that strength could be gentle, that logic could have heart, that the newest civilization in the galaxy might have wisdom that the oldest had forgotten. And it ended with a galaxy transformed, one conversation at a time, one connection at a time, one moment of genuine understanding at a time. Humanity had taught the stars how to talk to each other, and the stars had listened.